Good morning. I'm Barry Pavel, Senior Vice President and Director of the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Welcome to our Future Foreign Policy Series event on What Now for U.S.-Russia Relations. Clearly, we are amidst a very dynamic and potentially historic European security crisis as Russian forces continue massing on the borders of Ukraine, including in the Black Sea, while also conducting a nuclear exercise that is beginning as we speak. NATO has deployed minimal reinforcements to its eastern flank members, and diplomacy is ongoing. Fortunately, diplomacy does continue with Secretary of State Blinken and Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov likely to meet next week. Today, Vice President Harris will give a major speech on the crisis at the Munich Security Conference, where the Atlantic Council also has deployed, as you might imagine. And of course, as the Atlantic Council, we have intensively ramped up programming since the outset of the crisis across many of our centers and programs to offer U.S. and allied policymakers a wide range of actionable ideas to help protect allied interests and seek, as Secretary of State Blinken said, to prevent a war. Today's discussion is right down the middle of the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security's priorities. In the Scowcroft Center, we work to develop sustainable nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. The center honors the legacy of service of General Brent Scowcroft and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. In the Scowcroft Center, our New American Engagement Initiative's Future Foreign Policy Series seeks to bring fresh ideas into the foreign policy discourse and promote new constructive ways for the United States to exert leadership in the world in close cooperation with allies and partners. This is a time when creative new thinking is needed to avoid tragedy. The crisis threatens to deeply damage Ukraine. It poses a major challenge to the United States and its allies in NATO, as well as potentially NATO partners. An invasion of Ukraine, which many are saying is imminent, could constitute the largest conflict in Europe since World War II, endangering energy flows, sparking refugee crises, undermining the global rules-based system, and threatening even a broader conflagration. We at the Scowcroft Center and Atlantic Council have been working tirelessly to help policymakers resolve the crisis, and this event is part of that important work. I want to welcome our panelists who will discuss the state of affairs in Ukraine as of this morning, and what the ongoing crisis means for the future of U.S.-Russia relations. We have assembled an absolutely stellar group. Thank you to Samuel Charap, Senior Political Scientist at RAND, Michael Kaufman, whom I've been following very closely for his ongoing analyses. He is Research Program Director in Russia Studies at CNA, and our very own NAEI Senior Fellow, Emma Ashford. All three of these panelists are Russia experts with deep knowledge of the history that surrounds Russia's relationship with Ukraine and can provide insights into Russia's behavior and how the alliance may most effectively respond. I also want to welcome our moderator, Alex Ward, or I should really say welcome back, since Alex, his most important career accomplishment was working in the Scowcroft Center in our strategy area. Alex is now national security correspondent at Politico, where he writes their National Security Daily newsletter. I highly recommend it. He's been following developments in Ukraine closely. Thank you for joining us today, Alex. And thanks to those of you tuning in as well. If you have questions for the Q&A portion of the event, please, as always, submit them using the Q&A function on Zoom. And with that, over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Barry. I'm happy to be back at the place that started my 401k account. So, good to always be at the Atlantic Council. So look, we've got only an hour to solve all of Ukraine's problems, so let's just go right into it. And let's start with the big news, which is you've got not only nuclear exercises that Russia's engaging in, but it looks like we've got and I should say not just look like, we do have a spike in shelling and in contact in the Donbass, and we've got the leader of the Donetsk separatist region saying that there's about to be an evacuation to the Rostov region of Russia, and because there's a suspected Ukrainian attack that Zelensky is going to order. Of course, we take that with all the grains of salt in the world. So, Michael, tell me, is this the pretext we've all been waiting to see?
Yeah, You're seeing pretty clear indicators of a pretext being constructed at this point. They've started to pick up momentum. In the background leading up to this, you probably heard some Russian accusations behind supposed Ukrainian war crimes as well, and something about graves being found. And now you see a dramatic escalation along the line of contact of artillery skirmishes and exchanges that we really haven't seen because the ceasefire has largely held in recent months. And yeah, the leader of DNR, Donetsk People's Republic, is basically signaling that they expect an imminent Ukrainian attack and are going to be evacuating to Rostov, which is a very foreboding step because that suggests they anticipate a military operation. And this entire affair has very eerie vibes reminiscent to summer of 2008. So some of the things that happened in the run-up to the Russia-Georgia war. So it is looking like it's picking momentum, and most importantly, Russian news and media is focusing on the story. It is carrying it, and it's going to take off within the Russian media and press.
So, I mean, Emma, from what I just heard, that sounds like war is coming?
I mean, it's certainly ominous. I don't think you're going to get anyone on this call or anyone else following this to say it's a definite thing. But yeah, there are some indications, that things are changing on the ground. And I'm particularly concerned, sort of as Michael already alluded to, I'm particularly concerned that Russian state media is starting to put out narratives that would be useful in selling a conflict to the Russian population. So comments about genocide, comments about mass graves, comments about civilians in the separatist regions of Ukraine being injured or involved in conflict, add all of that to some of the things that the administration has put out that we might expect the Russians to claim there's a false flag attack. And there's a lot of pretext building going on here. And again, that is in line with how Russia has handled prior conflicts like this, where there's often a narrative that's sold along with the conflict. So, I mean, I don't think, the window for diplomacy is 100% shut, but it does look likely that we're headed into a conflict.
I do want to talk about that diplomatic bit, but Sam, I do want to ask very quickly, yes, we've seen the Russians use this pretext playbook before, but why not just do it? Why go through this whole pretext thing at all?
Well, it's a good question. I think there are two reasons. One, a war against Ukraine with a lot of civilian casualties is not something that will go down easy with the Russian public. So there has to be some explanation, logic as to why this is happening and why this is justified. I think that's part of it. And second is that, Russia is not going to denounce the UN Charter, say it is engaging in territorial aggression and that borders no longer mean anything. Even if it does do things that suggest precisely that, it's going to have even a flimsy cover of why what it's doing is somehow justified internationally, both to sell in fora like the UN Security Council and to third parties, so that at the end of this, they'll have some way of claiming that this was not contrary to international norms. And we saw that in 2014 when the annexation of Crimea was justified as an act of national self-determination, and the invasion of eastern Ukraine was justified by denying the actual invasion itself. So Russia's never actually admitted to being there. So this is sort of Russia, as it understands it, playing the role of when great powers violate the rules, they claim that they're actually complying with them. And that's sort of how you get other states to comply with them as well.
Emma, was there anything the US, the West, could have done differently to maybe avoid the moment that we're seeing now? Many commentators that I know I've been speaking to say, look, there was little more the US could have done other than rally allies, say there's about to be a bunch of sanctions, call out the intelligence that they found. Although some would say maybe the US should not have taken the military option off the table. But anyway, you talk to me. I mean, was this the best the West could do, and this outcome was going to happen kind of regardless?
Right, so I think there's a difference between long-term and short-term. Long term, I think there are a number of things that the West, that the US could have done to avoid this situation. I mean, the lights have been blinking red on Russia's sort of security concerns in the former Soviet space and the things that it's willing to do to protect those interests. Those lights have been blinking red basically since 2008 Georgia, if not before. And we sort of haven't really changed our approach to things like NATO expansion, to how we consider European security, to how we regard Russia. Our policy hasn't changed in that time. So over the long term, I think, there's plenty of things we could have done. In the shorter term, I think it's a more questionable assumption that we could have prevented this conflict. I do sort of think the administration has very much taken the right approach here by not shutting off the door to diplomacy, by continuing to talk to the Russians throughout this whole process, by not preemptively levying sanctions and other things, but rather keeping them in reserve, using them as an actual deterrent against Russian military action. Now, perhaps if we had been willing to be more flexible, more open to things like, considering conventional arms control, ways to de facto, make the question of NATO expansion to Ukraine or Georgia less problematic. I think there's things we could have done that might have got us to an agreement here. But I think you can't say for sure that we definitely could have prevented that. The Russians were clearly trying to use this force to negotiate, but we may never have been able to meet their negotiating demands.
Michael, you wrote many weeks ago in War on the Rocks, perhaps I think one of the more well-known pieces now about this entire conflict, about how you analyzed and basically said that, look, you were pessimistic about the prospects here. So I want to ask, since you've been pessimistic since the beginning, was there anything different the US could have done? Did they miss some steps? Did the West miss some steps? Or again, was this the natural outgrowth?
That's a tough question. So looking back at it, I was pretty skeptical that we could find a diplomatic solution, given the demands that Russia presented early on in December, and also the way in which they had presented them, which looked very performative and would make it very difficult to find a resolution. I'm personally not sure that there's anything we could have done differently. I think we're all operating under constraints, us European allies, and to be honest, a lot of this was also contingent to some extent on Ukraine. Ukraine has tremendous agency, right? So we often have this US-centric view of the world. Is there anything the United States could have done? Well, the principal conflict is between Russia and Ukraine, right? This is one of it's not the entire focus of it. Obviously, we're here having a conversation as well about European security. Russian demands for security guarantees were well above and beyond Ukraine to the US and NATO. But I hate this kind of US-centric view of the world, right? This is an interaction between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine had tremendous agency in this too. Right, so we don't control some of the countries involved. That's the reality of it, and we should be honest and frank about that. We can at best support them, but they also make their own choices.
So maybe to put a fine point on it, had Zelensky come out and said, "We will not seek NATO membership," would we be seeing the events we're seeing in this moment?
So I've been a skeptic that would be a solution to this problem. I think maybe at some point that might have been good enough for Russia, but I think they were signaling clearly that they wanted quite a bit more than that. And so my honest answer is I'm skeptical. I don't know. They were clearly signaling it's not just about Ukraine and NATO, but also NATO and Ukraine. And it wouldn't resolve the major impasses over Minsk II agreement, what to do with the occupied territories, so on and so forth. So this was only one piece of the puzzle. So I'm frankly unsure. I don't think it would have resolved the issue, but it was interesting to at least see Ukrainians kind of float some trial balloons about neutrality to see how the public would react. And I will tell you, it was unfortunate to see this kind of discourse very, very late in the game, when it was frankly too late to do anything with it. Because the general public reaction in Ukraine was not sort of a venomous uprising to the proposition, right? Some had anticipated and said, when they actually tested the theory, it wasn't this tremendous public outcry. So all I will say is that I don't think we're ever going to know, right? Because some of the things that were floated at the very end were proposed far too late to make any difference.
Sam, you were nodding your head.
Yeah, I mean, it is striking that, at the 11th hour, trial balloons are being floated in a very tentative way from various Ukrainian officials on this issue. I mean, they're in a tight spot. We should recognize that, given that the former President Poroshenko passed a constitutional amendment before leaving office enshrining NATO aspirations in the Constitution, making sort of limiting the freedom of maneuver of his successors. But and I agree with Mike that it is perfectly plausible to suggest that the diplomatic negotiating piece of this has been a time-buying exercise for Russia, and that their intention was to proceed really no matter what militarily. That said, trying as hard as possible to avoid that outcome as a matter of policy. I mean, we can analyze it as a matter of analysis as to whether there was a diplomatic opportunity or not, but the U.S. government really had to pursue that because the alternative was so much worse. That is, it had to pursue the diplomacy. Whether or not more things could have been put on the table, and whether or not that would have potentially headed off this outcome, I think is now sort of counterfactual. I would agree with Emma, though, that if you take a step back, this has been it has been clear that the status quo ante, before this crisis that emerged late last year, was not going to be sustainable for the long term. That is the sort of simmering conflict that settled in after Minsk II, that was signed in February 2015. And Russia was never going to accept geopolitical defeat in Ukraine. And so the fact that this, that a crisis surrounding Ukraine's sort of geopolitical status would emerge seemed pretty clear long before late last year. So I think there was long-term opportunities that certainly could have been taken advantage of that weren't. I mean, let's just take a counterfactual of imagine, obviously there are a lot of ways in which this is hard to imagine, that Minsk II were actually implemented in, say, 2019. Would we be here today? Hard to imagine that would be the case.
So Emma, since you were the first one to float, hey, there could be some diplomatic openings here. Tell me, what do you got? What can you recommend to basically NATO at this point to go, hey, here, offer this to the Russians and see what they say?
I mean, for the last couple of weeks, I think, opinion has been circling, at least among those that are practically minded about diplomacy, opinion has been circling around a few sort of core things. And again, I want to echo this point that I think it's notable that a lot of these sort of slightly out of the box ideas, trial balloons, are emerging so late in the game, perhaps too late to actually do any good here. But the sort of the core components are thinking about some kind of new conventional arms control regime for Europe. So this is obviously very big blue sky thing, but we lost the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe back in 2015 or so. Trying to think of a way to, assuage Russian security concerns about NATO military presence in the states of the former Soviet Union, not as a part of NATO membership, but as a question of conventional arms control. So that's one idea that's been out there, that's been floated. There's other ideas, mostly involving, ways for the states, again, the states of the former Soviet Union, the ones that aren't sort of in NATO and the European Union already, to think about ways for them to economically integrate with the West while also maintaining some ties with Russia. So to try and reduce the zero-sum nature of this problem, which I think is to be frank, is at the root of the current conflict and a lot of the conflicts we've seen in this zone. The problem is these are all big, long-term solutions to the problem. And again, they've emerged so late in the process that I'm not sure if they'll be able to solve this before we end up in a conflict. However, I will say that these ideas, as unfortunate as it is, these may be the things that we come back to in 6 months or a year if there is a conflict, because these are the same questions. We're trying to solve the same problems and the same questions now as we will be even after a conflict. I saw Sam had a finger up there.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I agree with all that. I think that the thing is that Russia's made clear that while they're interested in these sort of more what they call second order issues of regarding arms control and the sort of INF 2.0, that they want to resolve the big picture political security architecture questions, and first and foremost the question of Ukraine's potential NATO membership. And it should be said that there also have been ideas floated on that issue, not only by the Ukrainians, but by the German chancellor and apparently the French president, at least ways in which the reality that Ukraine is in fact not on a NATO membership track could be somehow said out loud in some way, some form. And the chancellor came close to saying it. So something, it seems, that's the Hail Mary at this point, to use an American football metaphor. It would have to involve some, Ukraine's geopolitical status, so to speak, and potential future NATO membership. Some way of addressing it without crossing NATO red lines and without crossing Ukrainian constitutional red lines, which is sort of hard to imagine. But nonetheless, I think that's if something is to happen, it's going to have to involve that issue. That would be my take.
Michael, I don't know if you have anything to add on that, because again, you're pessimistic about the Ukraine offering NATO membership off the table. Has all of this, again, not only just come too late, but in your mind, do you think there was even a chance that back in the back of people's minds, they were going, I'm not sure an invasion is actually going to happen. This is all bluff.
Yeah, I think part of the issue of how this has played out, I actually learned a tremendous amount as a military analyst, because I realized how difficult it is to convince people of the prospect of a large-scale interstate war, despite all the indicators pointing to its likelihood. And most people looking at all the facts on the ground were willing to believe any story other than Russia's preparing for a large-scale military operation. They were willing to believe it's a bluff. They were willing to believe in the strange theory that it's a long-term coercive play to choke the Ukrainian economy. That's what Ukrainians were rolling with. And they still believe that. Believe it or not, Ukrainians themselves, still the political leadership, don't actually necessarily believe that an invasion is coming. I know they're making all the preparations, but people are saying, even Zelensky in Munich right now is still telling him that he thinks it's unlikely. It kind of sounds like the administration from Don't Look Up. So I realized how difficult it is actually to convince people of the proposition that there is actually going to be a large-scale conflict between states. And because, when people don't believe that invasion is likely, they're not going to necessarily make the political compromises, right? What your interpretation is going to dictate the amount of political will and resolve that you generate to try to compromise to resolve the issue. Right? So yeah, this has been my unfortunate takeaway from it. And because, I've been talking about this for months. Now we're at the point where most people are convinced. But we actually only got here barely in the last couple of weeks, I would say.
So then let's talk about being here. We've done our due diligence. We've talked about the prospects for peace. It does not look good. So now we have to talk about what war is going to look like. With Captain Picard behind you, which seems appropriate, talk to me about what you think the likely military scenarios here are. We've obviously heard about, a campaign from the east towards the river. We've heard about a quick strike into Kyiv. We've heard about a land bridge to Moldova for the Black Sea. I'm sure there are others. Talk to me what you think is the most likely. All, some, none.
It's going to be really bad. I mean, those kind of scenarios and big angry red arrows coming down across the map are very realistic propositions. You should think really about the worst possible outcome, where there will be a pincer movement to encircle Kyiv, the capital. There will be large movements to envelop the bulk of Ukrainian forces in the southeastern part of the country and the line of control at the Donbass. The fight is not going to be at the line of control in the Donbass. I just want to make it very clear. There's going to be a large-scale military operation across eastern Ukraine to the capital. and in the south as well, very likely along the southern coast. And that's in some ways almost an optimistic scenario. And to the question, does Russia have the forces to do it? Yes, it does. It has the forces in place, forward deployed to conduct this kind of operation. It also has follow-on auxiliary forces that strongly suggest that Russia intends to hold territory for some amount of time. Obviously, Ukraine is a very large country. And if you're just going to do a military operation of this size and scale, you're going to end up holding terrain, right? Just the operational realities of it. I don't have kind of a speculative view on the prospect of long-term prolonged occupation, but I want to be clear, this is going to have maximalist war aims, regime change in Kiev, right? That's going to be the objective. This will not be a repeat of 2014, 2015. There are lots of folks out there who believe that. This is not what's going to happen in my view.
I just want to be super clear here. So this is more, to borrow a phrase from the US military, the Russians have enough to do like a clear hold and build kind of scenario.
I don't think Russians are going to do hold and build. This is not a nation building exercise, and Ukraine's not Iraq. But the very first part of that analogy, sort of a run to Baghdad, a campaign that lasts several weeks, overwhelms the opponent's forces, gets to the capital, actually has forces in the capital, so on and so forth, conducts regime change, and then maybe installs some kind of interim government or change the constitution. I won't speculate on the political dynamics. I'll only say they wouldn't be doing this if they didn't have an inside track with Ukrainian political elites, and if they didn't believe that they could put together a government. There's another shoe to drop in the story that we just don't know about. Don't believe that. Don't believe that they're just completely reckless fools and they don't have a plan. If they're going to do this, they have a political plan for what Ukraine looks like the day after.
Emma, describe to me what this will do to Ukraine. Just, let's be very specific about the humanitarian cost here. Mute. Yep.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, Ukraine is one of the largest countries in Europe. It's the largest country by landmass in Europe other than Russia. It has an extremely large population. I mean, this is going to be a ground war on the scale that we haven't seen in decades. I mean, perhaps all the way back to World War II, but at least back to, maybe 68. And the civilian costs of such a conflict are likely to be really high. Not necessarily because a Russian invasion would be particularly brutal or they'd go after civilians, but they will almost certainly engage in large scale. There will be airstrikes, there will be missile strikes as part of this campaign. But there will be human costs in terms of there will be a massive flow of refugees trying to get out of the conflict zone, pushing towards the West, pushing towards the European Union. And from everything we know, there's been some sort of quiet preparations on the part of the European Union, but thus far it appears to be mostly an every state for themselves proposition in terms of preparing for an influx of refugees. So this has the capacity to be quite a large-scale human crisis in the center of Europe.
Sam, are there any prospects to avoid, this is too strong, but the Ukrainians have agency here, right? They're going to fight back. You can assume that there's going to be some civilian resistance. Talk to me about there's been talk constantly that the Russians are basically going to sweep through. That may be the case, but what are the chances in your mind that there is going to be certain moments in this Russian campaign where the Ukrainians actually kind of put a stop to certain Russian aims?
I mean, it's hard to predict in advance. I mean, I think we'll know a lot. So the Russian operation is likely to begin with a air and missile strike campaign, and how Ukrainian forces respond to that will, I think, be quite telling. But the extent to which they're able to pin down the bulk of the Ukrainian armed forces, which are arrayed along the line of contact, which you'll note is not like where the bulk of the Russian forces are. If they're surrounded early in the conflict, which seems entirely plausible, they might not have the opportunity to do much by way of fighting back. And they're going to be outmanned, outgunned, and surrounded quite quickly. To say nothing of the sort of terror being unleashed from the skies. So I think in the actual fight, it's unlikely to be there's unlikely to be much by way of a military challenge for the Russians. Now, over the medium to long term, that they're the way if there's this sort of IRA like insurgency / terrorist movement, I mean, that could inflict costs on Russia while it is occupying, if that is something that it does in the medium term. I mean, I'm sort of I tend to agree with Mike that the Russians are likely to rely on Ukrainians to do most of the occupying for them, so to speak. But it's unclear the extent to which preparations now and willingness now to engage in resistance will translate to actual resistance after a brutal Russian air campaign and the sort of collapse of the Ukrainian military. Basically, firm predictions are probably not something any of us should be in the business of making right now.
Well, I'm going to ask you to make some predictions right now. So,
okay.
No, I'm kidding. So, I mean, talk to me about 6 months from now. Where are we, right? If we're expecting an attack any day now, right? To use quotes from the government, imminent from Linda Thomas Greenfield just yesterday. In 6 months, do we have possibly, what maybe percentage chances instead of likely, not likely, but do we have a Russian puppet regime in Kyiv? Do we have a larger extension of Russian control east of the Dnieper? Do we have that land bridge? I mean, where do we think we are in 6 months, Michael?
I mean, I think I'm 6 months. I'm even more underslept and disheveled than I am now as a mill analyst tracking this. That's how I picture my future six months if this truly happens. But I think we definitely have a prolonged Russian force presence in Ukraine for some time. We likely do have an insurgency in the western part of Ukraine, but we don't know if that's how far the Russian military is going to advance in their planning. I think that we have a completely changed European security environment. I think that the conversation in Europe flips tremendously. And part of the reason why is because there's still plenty of people in Europe that don't think this is going to happen. They think that at the last minute, Vladimir Putin's going to back off and do something else, maybe engage in a permanent force presence in Belarus. And by the way, I think there's going to be a permanent Russian military presence in Belarus at the end of this too. That's going to be a part of it either way. So the bad news is that too will come to pass. But my take on it is that the real issue is we have a follow-on crisis from this. The biggest concern now for the United States is actually not Ukraine. It is the follow-on crisis between Russia, United States, and NATO that develops from this. Ukraine is the beginning of a new phase in this crisis, not the end. If we implement strategic sanctions, Russia will not take that lying down. They will retaliate. We will get into an escalating crisis, and it may become a follow-on security crisis, a generally militarized crisis between Russia and NATO, depending how the situation develops. I want to be frank about that. And part of the reason there are these big conversations about changes in U.S. force posture in NATO is to be able to deter any potential sort of regional escalation, to try to keep this as a confined conflict, but also to think about the future. What does the security picture look like in the coming months? And of course, U.S. allies and NATO are going to demand more forces, more presence resulting from this. There'll be a great deal of fear and apprehension and countries looking for assurance. And there'll be a much higher level of U.S. military posturing generally. The United States is going to make big kind of, as the military calls them, muscle movements in changing its force posture as well. So not to make this sound even worse than it is, I want folks to appreciate that whatever happens now in Ukraine is not how this crisis ends, right? We then enter a different phase in this conversation.
I would agree. I would underscore, they say around here, foot stomp, something that Michael mentioned in passing, but that the kind of Russia-NATO confrontation that both Russia and NATO would like to avoid is something they might get anyway. So that this is going to be really a sort of escalation spiral, an inadvertent or at least unintended secondary crisis that is entirely plausible given the likely actions that both sides are going to take following the initial Russian military intervention. So the significant U.S. sanctions, the Russian retaliation, the U.S. reinforcement of Eastern Flank allies, all of this you could see spiraling quite quickly. I mean, things that the U.S. might do, military might do, that are entirely justified in themselves, say, assisting with an evacuation mission, engaging in a deterrence mission in states that border Ukraine, could be seen quite differently in the general staff in Moscow, and that could, produce reactions that take us to a place that I think really neither side wants to go.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess, one step that we're sort of jumping over here when we go 6 months out is we're jumping over the US and allied response to, a potential Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that, as sort of both Michael and Sam have said here, that is what potentially makes this a broader security concern, a broader potential conflict. We know the contours of what a sanctions package will look like. In fact, that's been part of the administration's approach to this whole crisis, has been to make it clear to the Russians what sanctions they'll get if they invade. And, there's both a sort of a good and bad to that. Is, we know at this point that energy sanctions are pretty much off the table. That's a good decision because those are mutually so destructive to European economies and to Russia that it's probably better to take them out of the equation. But there are the contours of a package involving significant financial sanctions on Russian banks. We don't know exactly which ones, but presumably on some of the bigger Russian banks. Export controls for high tech and things like that. Now, the thing is, we don't actually know how big an effect those sanctions will have. There's a relative possibility that those financial sanctions will have enough carve-outs to avoid sort of economic pain in Europe, that things will, that the sanctions won't have much of an effect. But there's another scenario where, the sanctions are written fairly broadly on major Russian financial institutions, causing runs on the banks inside Russia, a major, financial crisis inside Russia, causing the government to pull down its reserves to try and prop up the banks. All of this would be extremely bad inside Russia. And again, that could prompt further responses from the Kremlin towards the West. There has been some mention by the Russians, I think it's mostly a bluff, that they would consider using energy as a tool, but in sort of the worst situation, I don't think it's out of the question. And so, again, what happens after the first few days of an invasion, that is going to really affect where we are 6 months from now. And 6 months from now, as Michael notes, we could all be much older, much tireder, and in a much worse place.
Emma, you make a great point on this. And so I guess I want to stick with you here. If the goal of the US and Europe to this point has been stop a war, right? If the war happens, that is no longer the goal. What replaces that as the Western goal in this crisis? Is it contain it, kick the Russians out, stem a refugee crisis, all of the above, none of the above? What is the sort of rethink after the war starts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the response after a war starts here is basically two big things. One is to stem the fallout, the overspill from a crisis in Ukraine. So things like refugee flows, things like, building up on NATO's eastern flank, worries about where Russian troops are now deployed, whether that's in Ukraine and Belarus, but in general, trying to stem any overspill from this conflict into other European states, because that is a real possibility here, and one that we should be very wary of. So that's one part of this. And then the second part of this is, acknowledging that there is a new reality on the ground once the Russians go into Ukraine, is trying to think again about these bigger questions of Europe's security architecture. because I worry that where we're going to end up is, a situation not unlike the Cold War. We're going to have a fairly hard militarized security line running through Europe. It'll be 1,000 miles further east of where it was during the Cold War, but we're going to have a very militarized standoff between NATO countries and between Russia and Russia-aligned or controlled countries running along the edge of Ukraine and Belarus. And in that context, we have to go back to some of those Cold War lessons about ways to mitigate the threat that can come from having so much sort of military equipment and build up in one place. And we have to start thinking about conventional arms control, about Helsinki-like agreements, albeit the Helsinki framework is a non-starter for the Russians. We have to think about solving those bigger problems. Now, that's going to be politically a very difficult sell here in the US after Russia invades a European country. But that doesn't mean that it's not the approach we're going to have to take in practical reasons.
Sam, since I know you've been thinking about this for a bit, is Emma on the money here, or do you diverge a bit?
I mean, I agree with largely with what she said. I would add just a couple points. First of all, I think this is a really hard question, and it will be extremely. I don't envy the U.S. policymakers who will have to be trying to think about what it is exactly that we're trying to achieve. If and when deterrence fails and Russia does in fact launch this operation, that is going, keeping that in mind, that Russia will be controlling the sort of tempo of events much more so than we will be, particularly when this, if this begins, is an important factor here, and is going to be, in other words, their actions will sort of shape our ability to what our plausible objectives could be. Another point to make here is that although we're going to have to engage in cost imposition, particularly via sanctions, cost imposition doesn't solve our problems. It certainly was not going to solve Ukraine's problems. And so it may be justified, and we may want to do it for signaling reasons, or to ensure the credibility of our deterrent threats in the future. But it's not going to uninvade Ukraine. And that is something, at least, that we're going to have to bear in mind, and trying to think about using sanctions as potential leverage in some sort of negotiation where we can achieve a better outcome for Ukraine and European security. So, I mean, some principles perhaps to think about in this context are certainly, trying to avoid that escalation spiral that Michael and I were referring to, minimizing human suffering, both through assistance with refugees and the humanitarian assistance inside Ukraine, and ensuring the credibility of Article 5 in that context as well, given that Russia will have moved potentially militarily much closer to several allies which border Ukraine.
Well, okay. I could listen to more of this, and you keep going with the conversations. I know I have more questions, but I will go to the audience now for a few moments. And apologies if I get your name wrong. I can only go with what's on here. So the first one seems like a very Emma question, which is, would or can Biden stop Nord Stream 2 by any means? Would it be practicable? And I guess I'm paraphrasing here. Would doing so also kind of punish the Germans?
Yeah, so simple answer to that, yes. If Biden really wanted to stop Nord Stream 2, he could stop it. He could stop it unilaterally without the Germans. We know that the Trump administration had levied sanctions on German companies for this specific reason. So we could stop it. I think a more likely scenario, actually, in the case of an invasion, is that the Germans probably do get on board and help to, or say that Nord Stream 2 is just not going to happen. That said, we should also be very realistic about the actual impact of shutting down Nord Stream 2. And this was why this was always a very sort of stupid hill to die on for the Trump administration, because Nord Stream 2 is not going to hurt Russia's energy revenues substantially. The gas that was going to flow through Nord Stream 2 already flows to Europe through other pipelines. In many ways, Nord Stream 2 was about helping the Russians and the Germans circumvent Ukraine rather than anything else. And so shutting down Nord Stream 2 in the absence of other energy sanctions isn't really hurting the Russian bottom line. So again, I think we're focusing on the wrong thing, even though it will probably happen.
Michael, Antonina Sharevko has questions that I think are perfect for you to answer. There are about two of them. So the first is more of a comment, a critique, I think, of this conversation, which is saying that, look, talking about NATO expansion seems ironic. Georgia was attacked months after rejecting a plan to join the alliance. Ukraine was attacked in 2014, its official stance was not to join NATO. So referring to NATO expansion sounds as reiterating some sort of Kremlin propaganda pretext. That's part one. And part two is, if the prospects for Ukrainian self-defense are assessed as pessimistically as we're doing here, what would we assess of the security prospects of the Baltics, seeing as Russian ideologists clearly include the Baltic states and former Warsaw Pact countries as part of their expansion plans? Two very simple questions for you to answer.
Well, I'll take the second one first, actually, which is I don't actually think that Russia remotely views the Baltics the way it views other parts of the former Soviet space. Even Vladimir Putin, when he talks about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, sometimes says that it dissolved into 12 constituent parts, literally ignoring the last three PIDs, which were the Baltics. So I think there's a very different Russian view of the Baltics in general compared to countries like Ukraine or Belarus or Georgia. And I wouldn't subscribe to much of what anything Russian ideologists write. The country is run by one particular person, and in that regard, what he thinks matters. And he's been pretty consistent in his outlook on the Baltics and some of these countries. On NATO enlargement, this whole conversation. Well, it's a very important geopolitical context, right? I hate when the conversation gets subsumed to one of two extreme positions, that either this entire thing is about NATO enlargement, which it definitely isn't. For me, the proximate cause of this current conflict is actually interaction between Russia and Ukraine. And Ukraine lies at the center of several Venn diagrams, of which the conversation on European security and NATO enlargement is just one of them, right? I hate monocausal theories in general of, international politics, because they're always wrong. But the second one is, we also can't say there's absolutely nothing to do with this, right? I mean, that's kind of ignoring a very large animal that's standing in the room in terms of the conversation. That the NATO enlargement and the Russian perception that what's happened in Europe was an order of exclusion, their perceptions do matter. Whether you agree with them or not, right? These people live in their own particular reality in terms of their strategic culture. Those perceptions matter as drivers of Russian behavior, right? So you can disagree with it, you can say it's wrong, but it's important to recognize that it exists. And so this context is very much there, right? So I would never say that the Russia-Georgia war was a war caused by NATO expansion, or that the Russia-Ukraine war is a war caused by NATO expansion. But there's a factor in a creative geopolitical context for it. That's it. That's what I say. I hate both sides of that argument, if that makes any sense.
No both sidesing from Michael here. So Heather Hurlbert is happy that we have not used the word hybrid war or the phrase hybrid war during this entire conversation. But she is interested in hearing about Moscow's cyber offensive capabilities and how they'll play into the military picture that we painted here. I don't know who wants to take the cyber stuff.
I can jump in very briefly, but go ahead, Sam.
No, I was just going to say that I think we should differentiate here between informational and cyber activities that take place in the context of a sort of simmering conflict that along the lines of what was going on after February 2015 until late last year, and the cyber activities that have been and likely will be occurring going forward, because those will be in support of a conventional military operation to sort of soften the target, rather than something in itself done without a broader context. So I think we should think about what's going on now in a different way, because it is really in support of a conventional military operation.
Emma, this is from Gökhan Balaban. Is there anything various Ukrainian leaders since 1991 could have done differently to avoid the current situation?
I mean, absolutely. That's a very broad question, right? I mean, so many of Ukraine's internal problems are pretty well known at this point, right? The country has had a long history of corruption. Many of the problems we see across the post-Soviet space with privatizations, the rise of oligarchs, in the Ukrainian space, this was particularly shaped by transit fees for oil and gas and, the people that benefited from those, all of which weakened the Ukrainian political system over the long run. And I will say again, I think to the credit of governments in Ukraine in the last sort of 4 or 5 years, they've done a pretty good job of trying to improve on some of those things. I think the real question, though, is whether any of that would have dissuaded Russia from seeing Ukraine as intrinsically important to Russian security. So the phrase the Russians have been trotting out a lot lately is indivisibility of security, which means something quite different in the sort of European or United Nations context that it comes up in. But for the Russians, they've been arguing effectively that countries shouldn't be able to do something that makes their neighbors less secure. And this is a very strange concept, but I find it hard to see any steps that Ukrainian governments could have taken that would have dissuaded Russia from that viewpoint, that would have dissuaded them the idea that Ukraine is important to Russia and needs to stay close to Russia. So perhaps at the margins, there are some things that might have helped to diffuse crises. I think implementing Minsk II might have helped substantially, but over the long run, I don't think there's any magic bullet here that would have allowed Ukraine to move towards the West without Russia feeling some pinch from it.
Sam, you've done some negotiating with the Russians, so this is a good one for you from Bernardo Rico. And I should have mentioned the last question was from Gökhan Balaban, in case I didn't say it. I don't remember if I did. But this is from Bernardo Rico. Is it too late for the U.S. to lead discrete discussions with the Kremlin to make certain trades, such as the U.S., NATO, and the EU agreeing not to allow Ukraine to be part of NATO in exchange for medium-term Russian agreeing to exit Venezuela or Nicaragua or something like that? Anyway, tons of stuff. But is it too late for, I guess deep down, the question at its core is it really too late for even super discrete, somewhat even back-channel negotiation?
It might be too late. The events of the last 48 hours might suggest that, the sort of button has already been pushed, so to speak, and we're sort of witnessing the prelude to actions that have already been prescripted. That said, as a matter of policy, given how consequential and, catastrophic the outcomes of this action could be for U.S. interests, I would be recommending we be trying every channel of communication we have to see if there's a way to forestall, avoid this kind of an outcome. So what the nature of that bargain might be is another story, but I think, we have no choice as a matter of policy but to try to pursue it.
Mike, this one's directed at you from Zachary Pakin of the Center for European Policy Studies. When you say that Russia has enough troops in place to conduct the sort of operations you've described, why do so many analysts, including Ukrainian ones, contend that twice as many troops would be needed? From what I can tell, I being Zach, the size of Ukraine's armed forces are still larger than the number of Russian troops currently deployed on the border.
Okay, well, first or not, the size of the Ukrainian armed forces are not larger. Second, size doesn't matter. That's not how military analysis is done in terms of quantity of forces, okay? Russia has tremendous quantitative and qualitative force overmatch. The force multipliers that they bring in terms of air power and the like that Ukrainians don't have are tremendous. So the actual net value and combat effectiveness of the forces as they are positioned gives Russia very, very large advantages, very clear. Second, there's always been a straw man in this conversation, which is the prospect of Russia invading all of Ukraine. the largest country in Europe with 37 million people. I don't think that was ever in the cards. Okay. If we look about Eastern Ukraine, the capital, maybe southern regions, very quickly you get to a territory that's quite smaller with maybe about 17 million people in it. Okay. If we look at Eastern regions and the capital, a couple more million in the south, right? So not enough, really. The United States invaded Iraq, which had 26 million people with about 190,000 troops, and went to Baghdad, a city of 5 million people. Actually didn't encounter that tremendous amount of resistance in Baghdad. Now, are there assumptions potentially very wrong about occupation of this territory? That may well be the case. That's a bit of a Schrodinger's cat question. We don't know, right? That's fair assessment. We don't know what an occupation by Russian troops would look like. We don't know what the Ukrainian resistance would look like. But to answer the question, does Russia have enough forces currently arrayed to defeat the Ukrainian military decisively and conduct an operation across this territory? Yes, they do. They very clearly do. And it looks very much like they're going to. And I certainly believe that they can, right? But by all indicators. Why do other analysts say that they don't? I don't know. There's a lot of people who end up being wrong in the analytical world. So what can I say in that regard? I guess I have a different perspective on the subject.
I'm going to make sure anytime I'm ever feeling happy, I'm going to call you, Mike. I think this is you're doing what you got to do. This is a question from Kelly Greco. Sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing your name, but it's one that I've had and I've been trying to report on myself, which is, let's talk about the European role in the diplomacy for a moment. Why has Putin been so dismissive of it mostly? At least, I'll just add from my own reporting here, even European officials are saying, yeah, I mean, Putin will entertain Macron and he'll entertain Scholz, but at the end of the day, the deal he wants is with Biden, and it's only the U.S. that can really deal something. Is that your guys' understanding as well?
I think that's more or less right. I think ultimately this has to do with Russian threat perceptions, and Russian threat perceptions when it comes to NATO are really about the U.S. As the most capable military within the alliance, and from the Russian perspective, the most threatening potentially. So clearly, and this has been true for a long time. When it comes to European security, they see the U.S. as the sort of key piece that and their primary negotiating partner, and that any deal that the Europeans might do without U.S. buy-in is not going to be sustainable, precisely because the U.S. is the most significant actor from their perspective on the other side of the equation.
I guess I'll end with this kind of question for me, and I think it's an accumulation of a lot of these. Barry, who was on the call earlier, likes to say, when you're talking about deterrence, it's deterring who from doing what. And I know we talked about this for a little bit, but I guess this also dovetails with the question of why now, right? Why do this? When you're seeing the strategic, as some say, mess for Putin of, NATO's further aligned, your oil revenues are going to get cut off, sanctions are going to happen. Like, it doesn't look good for him to do this long term, and yet, as some analysts would say, and yet he's probably going to still do it. So I guess putting all this together, why do this now, and why is he not deterrable, does it seem? Maybe I'll go with Emma for this one.
Yeah, so I actually think it might be helpful to flip that around a little, because I'm increasingly of the opinion that I think Russia may see what it is doing in Ukraine to some extent as a deterrent war. They're trying to deter the US, Western Europe, NATO from pushing further into the post-Soviet space. And this is consistent with the pattern that we've seen. The Russians took steps in Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 to create these little territorial disputes, little frozen conflicts that would mean that some of these states couldn't accede to NATO. That hasn't worked. The conversations about NATO expansion haven't stopped the notion that states like Ukraine or Georgia or others would continue to push towards the West. That hasn't stopped. And so, I think that rather than just thinking about why we can't deter Putin, I think we might want to think about what is it that Putin, that Russia are trying to do here. And I think they're trying to send a very clear signal, this far and no further. And so for them, I think this is part of deterring the West from trying to come any further into the post-Soviet space.
Well, okay. On that, I know we could talk about this a lot more. We only had roughly an hour to talk about it all, but I want to thank Sam, Emma, and Mike, and I want to turn to Matt Burrows to end this conversation. Thank you all.
Well, thank you, Alex, and thank you for to all the contributors and both the questioners and obviously our panelists. I have to say that it's not a very cheery way to start Friday, but it's something that we have to face. I'm the co-director of the New American Engagement Initiative. So, as you can see, we have our work cut out for us. We deal a lot with trying to, as Barry indicated at the beginning, thinking about unconventional ways of furthering U.S. security, but also the security of our allies. This is going to be looks like a military situation, but nevertheless, we also are thinking of non-military tools. And I think this will become far more important looking out 6 months or beyond to think about what are the ways that we navigate what looks like a new Cold War. We will be doing a lot more of these events. We hope that you are looking at our website and keeping track of our publications. And with that, I think we'll close off now. Again, thanks to everybody for their participation.